The cold metal floor of the cell had become familiar to Commander Lyra Vance after 37 days of captivity aboard the alien flagship called Eternity's Chorus. And she had learned to count time by the blue lights that flickered every 6 hours in the corridor outside her cage. She was not afraid. Not anymore. Because fear was a luxury she could not afford. When every moment required her full attention and sharp mind, the Valkyrie had taken her near. The Orion relay, when her scout ship lost power after a surprise ambush. And she had floated helpless in the darkness of space until their massive vessel swallowed her tiny craft like a whale swallowing a fish. They were strange creatures. These Valkyrie, with 4 arms that moved like dancers and wings that shimmered with colors she had no names for. And their eyes were made of hundreds of tiny lenses that watched everything at once. She had expected torture when they first dragged her from her ship. But instead, they gave her food and water and a clean place to sleep, which confused her until she understood their true purpose. They wanted to study her like a scientist studies. A bug under glass. The young Valkyrie female who visited her cell each day was called Desha. And she held the rank of overseer, which seemed to mean she was responsible for learning everything about the human. Prisonersha was beautiful in the way a deadly spider is beautiful, with delicate limbs and eyes that sparkled like black diamonds. And her voice made sounds that the translator chip in Lyra's ear turned into cold and precise words. "You are awake." "Terran," Desha said on the morning of the 38th day. Her 4 arms folded behind her back in what Lyra had learned was a pose of authority. "And I hope you slept well because today will be important for both of us." Lyra sat up on her simple bed and pushed her dark hair away from her face, saying nothing because she had learned that silence often revealed more than questions. "You do not speak much," Desha observed, tilting her head in a way that made her look like a curious bird. "And this is strange because most prisoners talk constantly, begging for freedom or crying about their families or making threats they cannot keep. What would you like me to say?" Lyra asked, her voice calm and steady. Thesha's wings fluttered slightly, which Lyra had learned was a sign of interest or surprise among the Valkyrie people. "I would like you to tell me about your species," Desha said, moving closer to the energy barrier that kept Lyra trapped. "Because my superiors have asked me to prepare a complete report on human capabilities, and I find that direct observation only reveals so much." Lyra stood and walked to the barrier, stopping just inches from the shimmering blue light that would shock her if she touched it. "What do you want to know?" she asked. "Everything," Desha replied. "But let us start with the obvious weaknesses, yes? You have only 2 arms, which limits your ability to perform complex tasks. And you have only 2 eyes that face forward, which means you cannot see threats approaching from behind. And you have only 1 heart, which means a single wound to your chest will kill you." Lyra listened without expression as the alien listed every way that humans were inferior to the Valkyrie. "You cannot see ultraviolet light," Desha continued, "and you cannot hear sounds below 20 hertz. And your skin is soft and easily damaged, and your bones break under pressure that would barely scratch a Valkyrie child. Is there a question in there somewhere?" Lyra asked. Desha made a sound that the translator turned into something like laughter, though it held no warmth or humor. "The question is simple, Terran," she said. "And it is this. How has your species survived at all when you are so clearly inferior to every other intelligent race in the galaxy?" Lyra smiled, and it was not a friendly smile. "Maybe you should find out for yourself," she said. Desha studied her for a long moment, those compound eyes examining every detail of Lyra's face and body and posture. "Perhaps I will," Desha said slowly, "because my report requires a demonstration of human combat capabilities, and the High Council has approved my request to test you in the arena of voices." Lyra felt her heart beat faster, but she kept her face blank and calm. "When?" she asked. "Tomorrow," Desha answered. "And you will fight against our training drones while the greatest minds of the Valkyrie collective watch and record everything. And when you fail, as you surely will, my report will be complete." She turned to leave, her wings catching the light and throwing rainbow patterns across the walls. "I am giving you a chance to prove your worth, Terran," Vesha said over her shoulder. "But do not expect miracles, because no species as limited as yours has ever impressed us before." After Vesha left, Lyra sat back down on her bed and closed her eyes. She thought about her training back on Earth, about the long hours in the combat halls where she had learned to fight with every weapon humanity had ever invented. She thought about her father, who had taught her to use a sword before she could ride a bicycle, and her mother, who had been a champion fencer before she became an admiral. She thought about all the times people had told her she could not do something, and all the times she had proven them wrong. The Valkyrie believed they knew everything about humans, because they had measured her body and scanned her brain and counted her arms and eyes and hearts, but they did not know what lived inside her. The fire that burned in every human soul, the stubborn refusal to accept defeat that had carried her species from caves to stars. Tomorrow she would show them. Tomorrow she would teach them why humans were not just another weak species waiting to be conquered. Tomorrow she would make them understand that having only 2 arms meant nothing, when both of those arms were guided by a will that would never break. She lay back on her bed and smiled in the darkness, feeling something she had not felt since her capture. She felt hope. And more than hope, she felt hunger. She was hungry for the fight that was coming, hungry to prove herself, hungry to show these arrogant aliens that they had made a terrible mistake when they decided to study humanity. Sleep came easily that night, because Lyra Vance knew exactly who she was and what she could do. Tomorrow, the Valkyrie would learn it too. The guards came for Lyra at dawn, or what passed for dawn, on a ship that sailed through endless night between the stars. There were 4 of them, tall Valkyrie warriors with armor that gleamed like polished beetles and weapons that hummed with deadly energy. And they looked at her with the same expression she had seen on faces back home when people looked at animals in a zoo. "The overseer is waiting," the lead guard said, his voice flat and bored. "And you will come with us now." Terran, Lyra stood and held out her wrists, expecting them to put restraints on her. But the guard just laughed. "We do not need to bind you," he said, "because where would you run on a ship full of warriors who could tear you apart with their bare hands?" She said nothing and followed them through the corridors of the Eternity's course, memorizing every turn and every door they passed, because a good soldier always knows her environment. The ship was massive, larger than any human vessel she had ever seen, and everywhere she looked there were Valkyrie going about their daily tasks, stopping to stare at her as she passed. Some of them pointed and whispered, and she caught fragments of their conversations through her translator. "Is that the Terran? So small and weak. Why does the Overseer waste time on such a creature?" Lyra kept her head high and her eyes forward, refusing to show any reaction to their insults. Let them think she was weak, because their arrogance would be their greatest weakness when the time came. The Arena of Voices was located in the heart of the ship, a massive circular chamber with walls made of crystal that allowed light to pour in from every direction. Observation platforms floated above the arena floor like clouds, and on these platforms sat hundreds of Valkyrie dignitaries in robes of silver and gold. Tesha stood at the edge of the arena, her wings spread wide in a display of authority, and she smiled when she saw Lyra approaching. "Welcome, Terran," she said, a voice amplified so that everyone in the chamber could hear. "And welcome to the Arena of Voices, where the Valkyrie have tested countless species to determine their worth." Lyra walked to the center of the arena and looked around at the watching faces above her. They were all so confident, so certain that they already knew how this would end. Today we will document human combat capabilities for the permanent record of the collective, Desha announced. And our scientists will analyze every movement, every reaction, every failure, so that we may understand exactly what this species can and cannot do. A murmur of approval rippled through the crowd. But first, Desha continued. Let me explain to our honored guests why this demonstration is important. Because many of you have never encountered a Terran before and may not understand why we bother studying them at all. She pressed a button on her wrist device, and a holographic image of a human body appeared in the air beside her. Observe the Terran form, Desha said, using one of her 4 arms to point at different parts of the image. And notice immediately the most obvious deficiency. They have only 2 arms. The crowd made sounds of pity and amusement. This means, Desha explained, that they cannot perform the complex multi-limb coordination that every advanced species requires for sophisticated combat, because their brains simply lack the neural pathways necessary for such tasks. Lyra watched and listened, her face revealing nothing. Furthermore, Desha said, they have only 2 forward-facing eyes, which creates massive blind spots that any competent opponent could exploit. And their reaction times are slow compared to species with proper compound vision. More murmurs from the crowd. More looks of pity directed at Lyra. Now, some of you may have heard rumors about human soldiers, Desha said, her voice taking on a dismissive tone. And these rumors suggest that Terrans are dangerous despite their obvious limitations. But I am here today to prove that such rumors are nothing more than primitive superstition. She gestured toward a section of the arena floor, and a rack of weapons rose from beneath the surface. The Terran will now select a weapon, Desha announced, and she will use that weapon to fight against our training drones. And we will all see for ourselves exactly what humans are capable of. Lyra walked slowly toward the weapon rack, examining each option carefully. There were energy lances that crackled with blue, lightning and plasma whips that glowed like liquid fire, and vibroblades that hummed at frequencies that made her teeth ache. And at the end of the rack, almost hidden behind the more impressive weapons, there were 2 short swords of simple design. They were Valkyrie ceremonial blades, meant for ritual combat rather than real warfare. But they were well balanced and sharp. Lyra picked up the first sword with her right hand and tested its weight. An acceptable choice, Desha said, although I would have recommended the energy lance for its superior reach. And Lyra picked up the second sword with her left hand. Chamber went completely silent. Desha's wings folded tight against her back, a sign of extreme distress that Lyra had learned to recognize during their many conversations. What are you doing? Desha demanded, her voice no longer amplified but sharp and high with confusion. I am selecting my weapons, Lyra said calmly, turning both blades in her hands to feel their balance. That is inadvisable, Desha said quickly, stepping toward the arena floor, because you clearly do not understand what you are attempting. And I must explain to you why dual wielding is impossible for your species. Lyra looked at her and raised one eyebrow. Impossible? She repeated. Yes, impossible, Desha said firmly, regaining some of her composure. Because dual wielding requires independent hemisphere processing that allows each arm to operate autonomously. And it requires ambidextrous motor control that must be developed from birth. And it requires predictive spatial tracking on parallel cognitive channels. She paused to let her words sink in. Our 4 armed warriors trained for decades to achieve proficiency with merely 3 weapons, Desha continued. And the idea that a 2-armed species could fight effectively with a weapon in each hand is anatomically and neurologically absurd. Lyra smiled. Is it? She asked. Desha's compound eyes seemed to flash with frustration. Put down the second sword, she said, her voice becoming hard and cold. and select a single blade like a sensible creature. Because this is your only warning, Terran Lyra did not put down the sword. Instead, she widened her stance and raised both blades into a guard position that felt as natural as breathing. "Release the combat drones," she said. The crowd above stirred and whispered, and Thesha stood frozen for a long moment, her forearms hanging limp at her sides. "You do not understand," Thesha said finally, "and I am trying to protect you from embarrassment. Because when you fail in front of all these witnesses, it will be recorded forever as proof of human inferiority. Release them." Lyra said. Thesha stared at her for another heartbeat, then turned and made a sharp gesture toward the control booth 6. Spherical drones rose from hidden compartments in the arena floor, each one bristling with shock prods and capture nets and sensors that tracked Lyra's every movement. One drone was considered a challenge for most Species 6 was a message, a way of telling the prisoner to know her place and accept her limitations. Lyra looked at the drones surrounding her, and she felt a familiar calm settle over her mind. This was the moment she had been waiting for. The moment when she would show them what it truly meant to be human. She raised both swords and spoke a single word that echoed through the silent arena. "Defend." The first drone attacked from behind, moving faster than the eye could follow. Its shock prod extended and crackling with enough electricity to drop a creature twice. Lyra's size, but Lyra was not there when the shock prod struck. She had already turned, her body spinning like a dancer, her left blade rising to catch the metal arm and redirect it into empty air, while her right blade swept down and severed the drone's stabilizer fin with a single clean cut. The drone wobbled and lost control, spinning wildly before crashing into the crystal wall with a shower of sparks and broken metal. The crowd above made a sound that was part gasp and part confusion, as if they could not believe what they had just witnessed. Thesha's compound eyes tracked every movement, recording every detail for later analysis. But her scientific mind was already struggling to understand what she was seeing. "Lucky," she whispered to herself. That was just luck, nothing more. The second and third drones came together in a pincer attack, one from the left and one from the right. Their shock prods aimed at Lyra's head and chest. Any normal fighter would have retreated or tried to block one while being struck by the other, because no creature with only 2 arms could possibly defend against 2 simultaneous attacks from opposite directions. But Lyra did not retreat. Instead, she stepped forward, moving into the narrow gap between the 2 drones. Her body passing through the space where their attacks crossed. Her left sword came up to parry the first shock prod, pushing it aside with a twist of her wrist, while her right sword drove forward into the second drone's sensor cluster. At the same moment, she kicked out with her left foot, catching the first drone in its central body and sending it tumbling backward. The second drone fell to the floor with Lyra's sword still buried in its core, and she pulled the blade free with a quick jerk as the first drone tried to recover its balance. But she was already moving, already attacking, her right sword slashing across the drone's power cables while her left sword blocked. Its desperate attempt to shock her metal screamed against metal. And then both drones were down, twitching and sparking on the arena floor. 4 seconds had passed since the fight began, and 3 drones were already destroyed. The crowd had gone completely silent, and even the floating observation platforms seemed to hang lower in the air, as if the dignitaries were leaning forward to see better. Thesha stood frozen at the edge of the arena, her 4 arms hanging limp at her sides, her wings pressed flat against her back in a gesture of total shock. "This is not possible," she said. But her voice was so quiet that no one heard her except the recorders that captured every sound in the arena. The 4th drone had learned from watching its companions fall, and it hung back at a distance, circling Lyra slowly while it calculated the best angle of attack. Lyra turned with it, keeping both swords raised in a guard position that left no openings. her breathing steady and controlled despite the exertion of the past few seconds. "Come on," she whispered to the drone. "What are you waiting for?" The drone's artificial brain processed thousands of possible attack patterns, searching for a strategy that would succeed where its companions had failed. It found none in every simulation it ran. The human female emerged victorious. And this should have been impossible, according to everything the Volcari knew about Terran capabilities. But machines do not feel fear or doubt. So the drone attacked anyway. It launched a capture net from its underside, spreading the weighted mesh wide to trap Lyra's arms and swords together at the same time. It dove toward her from above, its shock prods extended to maximum length, hoping to catch her while she was tangled in the net. It was a good plan. The best plan available given the circumstances. It failed completely. Lyra's left blade flashed upward, cutting through the center of the net before it could reach her, splitting it into two useless halves that drifted past her on either side. Her right blade was already moving toward the diving drone, and she stepped to the side at the last moment, letting the machine's own momentum carry it onto her sword. The blade punched through the drone's outer shell and into its power core, and the machine died with a sound like a screaming child. Lyra pulled her sword free and kicked the dead drone away, sending it rolling across the arena floor to join its fallen companions, 5 drones down, 1 remaining. The last drone had retreated to the far side of the arena, its sensors focused entirely on Lyra, its artificial brain working overtime to find some way to survive this battle. Thesha finally found her voice. "Stop the demonstration," she called out, her voice cracking with something that might have been fear. "This has gone far enough, and we have gathered sufficient data for the report." But the drone did not stop, because it had not received a shutdown command from the control booth, and its programming demanded that it continue fighting until it was destroyed or victorious. It launched itself at Lyra in a final desperate attack. All its shock prods extended, its capture nets deployed, its sensors screaming warnings that went unheard. Lyra watched it come with eyes that held no fear, only a cold and calculating patience that seemed entirely alien to the watching Valkyrie at the last moment. She moved her right sword, came up to catch the first shock prod, deflecting it harmlessly to the side, while her left sword drove forward into the drone's main body. But she did not stop there. She twisted both blades in opposite directions, one cutting left and one cutting right, and the drone split apart in the middle like a fruit cut in half. The 2 pieces fell to the floor on either side of her, still sparking and twitching. And then there was silence. 6 drones destroyed in less than 30 seconds. Lyra stood in the center of the arena, surrounded by broken machines, her chest rising and falling with deep breaths. Both swords still held ready in her hands. She looked up at the observation platforms, at the hundreds of faces staring down at her with expressions of shock and disbelief, and something that looked very much like fear. Then she looked at Desiath. Overseer had not moved from her position at the arena's edge, and her compound eyes were locked on Lyra with an intensity that seemed almost painful. "You said no species could dual-wield," Lyra said, her voice carrying clearly through the silent chamber. "And you said that fighting with a weapon in each hand was anatomically and neurologically impossible." She raised both swords and crossed them in front of her chest in a salute that human warriors had used for thousands of years. "You were wrong." The words hung in the air like a challenge, like a promise, like a warning, and for the first time in her long and distinguished career, Overseer Desha had absolutely nothing to say. The silence in the arena of voices lasted for what felt like hours. Though it could not have been more than a few heartbeats. Lyra stood among the wreckage of the 6 drones, her sword still raised, her eyes moving across the faces of the watching Valkyrie above her. She saw fear in some of those faces, confusion in others, and in a few she saw something that surprised her: respect. Then the whispers began. spreading through the observation platforms like wind through grass, growing louder and more urgent with each passing second. Did you see what she did? Impossible. The recordings must be wrong. 2 arms. She only has 2 arms. How is this possible? Desha finally moved, her wings unfolding slowly from her back, her 4 arms reaching out as if to steady herself against a reality that had suddenly become unstable. Clear the arena, she called out, her voice barely steady enough to carry, and have the medical team examine the prisoner for injuries. I am not injured, Lyra said calmly. Lowering her swords at last, Thesha looked at her with eyes that seemed different now, less cold and more curious. As if she was seeing Lyra for the first time. You will come with me, Thesha said, because we need to talk, you and I. And we need to talk alone. Lyra nodded and allowed the guards to take the swords from her hands. Though she noticed that they held her weapons with new respect, almost reverence, as if the blades had become sacred object. Thesha led her through corridors that Lyra had not seen before. Deeper into the ship where the lights were dimmer and the air was colder, they finally stopped at a door made of dark metal, and Desha pressed her hand against a panel that glowed briefly before the door slid open. The first room beyond was clearly Desha's personal quarters, filled with artifacts and books and holographic displays showing distant worlds and alien species. Sit, Desha said, gesturing to a chair that was clearly not designed for human bodies, but would serve well enough. Lyra sat, and Desha stood before her with all 4 arms crossed, her wings folded tight against her back for a long moment. Neither of them spoke. I have studied many species, Desha said finally, her voice soft and thoughtful, and I have written hundreds of reports documenting their capabilities and limitations. And in all my years of research, I have never been so completely and utterly wrong. Lyra said nothing, waiting for Desha to continue. When I first examined you, Desha said, I saw only what my training taught me to see, a creature with 2 arms and 2 eyes and 1 heart. A simple organism with obvious weaknesses and no apparent strengths. She turned away and walked to a window that showed the stars streaming past as the ship traveled through space. But today, I saw something different. She continued, and today I saw a warrior who moved with a grace and skill that should not exist. And today I saw my entire understanding of the universe proven wrong in less than 30 seconds. You made assumptions, Lyra said quietly, and you made the mistake that every powerful civilization makes sooner or later. You assumed that different means lesser. Desha's wings fluttered slightly. Yes, she admitted. And this assumption has guided Valkyrie policy toward other species for thousands of years. And it has worked well enough until now. Because most species really are inferior in the ways we expect them to be. She turned back to face Lyra. But humans are not most species, are they? No, Lyra agreed. We are not. Desha moved closer, her compound eyes studying Lyra with an intensity that was almost uncomfortable. Tell me how you did it, she said, because I need to understand. And not just for my report, but for myself. Because I cannot accept that everything I know about biology and neurology is wrong. Lyra considered the question carefully before answering. On Earth, she began. We have children who learn to play musical instruments that require both hands to work independently, moving in different patterns at different speeds. And these children learn this skill before they are 10 years old. Desha's eyes widened slightly. We have doctors who perform surgery with tools in both hands, while watching screens and speaking to their teams. Lyra continued, and we have athletes who juggle multiple objects while running and jumping and spinning. But the cognitive load, Desha protested. The neural pathways required for such coordination. Human brains are different from what you expected. Lyra interrupted gently. Because we evolved on a world where adaptability was more important than specialization. And our minds learned to do many things at once, rather than one thing perfectly. She leaned forward in her chair. Your warriors trained for decades to use 3 weapons with 4 arms, she said. But human warriors train for years to use 2 weapons with 2 arms. And we start young enough that the skills become part of who we are. Desha was silent for a long moment. This changes everything, she whispered. Yes, Lyra agreed. It does. The High Council will want to know what this means for our military planning, Desha said, almost to herself, and they will want to know if humans pose a threat to the collective. And they will ask me to recommend whether your species should be destroyed before you become too powerful. Lyra's expression did not change, but her voice grew harder. And what will you tell them? Desha met her eyes, and for the first time since they had met, Lyra saw something in those compound eyes that looked almost like admiration. I will tell them the truth, Desha said. And the truth is that humanity should not be challenged. Because any species that can do what you did today is a species that will never stop fighting, never stop adapting, never stop finding new ways to survive. She walked to her desk and picked up a datapad. I will tell them, she continued, that the Velkari Collective should seek peace with your people. Because the alternative is a war that will cost us more than we can afford to lose. Lyra felt something loosen in her chest. A tension she had not realized she was carrying. Thank you, she said. Desha made a sound that might have been a laugh. Do not thank me yet, she said. Because convincing the High Council to change thousands of years of policy will not be easy. And there are those who will want proof before they believe that a 2-armed species could ever be a threat. She looked at Lyra with eyes that sparkled with something new. Something that looked almost like mischief. But I think you have already given me all the proof I need, Lyra smiled. And this time it was a real smile, warm and genuine. So what happens now? She asked. Now, Desha said, I write my report and you rest. And tomorrow we find out whether my words can change the course of history. She gestured toward a door on the far side of the room. There is a bed through there, she said. And it is more comfortable than your cell. And you have earned at least 1 night of proper sleep. Lyra stood and walked toward the door. But she stopped before reaching it and turned back to face Desha. Why are you doing this? She asked. Why are you helping me? Desha's wings spread slightly, catching the light from the window. Because I am a scientist, she said. And scientists are supposed to follow the truth wherever it leads, even when it leads somewhere they never expected to go. She paused, and her voice grew softer. And because today you showed me something beautiful, Commander Vance. Something I will never forget for as long as I live. Lyra nodded and walked through the door. And behind her she heard Desha begin to type. The sound of words that would either save humanity or doom them to eternal war. Desha worked through the night, her 4 hands moving across multiple screens at once. Typing words that would either doom humanity or save them. She watched the recording of the arena fight again and again, slowing it down to study every movement, every strike, every impossible moment when Lyra had done what no creature with 2 arms should be able to do. The time the artificial dawn lit the corridors of the Eternity's chorus. Her report was completed, was the most important document she had ever written. And she knew it would change everything. The High Council chambers were located at the very top of the flagship. A massive circular room with walls made of living crystal that shifted color with the mood of those inside Desha stood before the 12 members of the council, her wings spread in the formal display required by tradition. Her heart's beating faster than she wanted to admit. Overseer Desha, the first speaker said, his voice ancient and cold. You have requested an emergency audience to present your findings on the Terran species. And we have granted this request. but I warn you that our patience is limited and our time is valuable. I understand. First speaker, Desha replied, and I promise you that what I have to say will be worth every moment of your attention. She activated the holographic display, and the image of Lyra appeared in the center of the chamber. Frozen in the moment before the fight began, 3 days ago, Desha said. I brought this human before you as a specimen to be studied, a creature to be measured and documented and ultimately dismissed as inferior. She pressed a button, and the recording began to play. The council watched in silence as Lyra destroyed the 6 drones, their ancient eyes tracking movements that seemed to defy everything they knew about biology and combat. When the recording ended, the silence continued for a very long time. This is a trick, one of the council members said finally. Some kind of deception created by the Terrans to intimidate us. It is no trick, Desha said firmly. And I have verified the recording with every tool available to me. And I have examined the destroyed drones myself. And I can confirm that what you have seen is exactly what happened. Then explain it, the first speaker demanded. Because what you have shown us is impossible, according to every scientific principle we know. Desha took a deep breath and began to speak. Humans are not what we thought they were, she said, and our assumptions about their limitations were based on incomplete understanding of their neural architecture and their evolutionary history. She pulled up diagrams and charts, showing the differences between Velkari brains and human brains. We assumed that having fewer limbs meant having less capability, she explained. But human brains compensate for their physical limitations by developing extreme adaptability and cross-functional coordination. Get to the point, another council member snapped. The point, Desha said, her voice hardening, is that humanity should not be challenged militarily, because they will adapt to whatever we throw at them, and they will find ways to defeat us that we cannot predict or prepare for. The council chamber erupted in angry voices, all 12 members speaking at once, their wings flashing colors of outrage and disbelief. Silence, the first speaker commanded. And slowly the chamber fell quiet. Let the overseer finish her report. Desha nodded gratefully. I have studied many species, she said, and I have helped the collective conquer dozens of worlds. And I have never once recommended that we avoid a fight. But today I am making that recommendation. She pulled up a final image, a star map showing human territory. They control fewer than 50 systems, she said. And their ships are slower than ours, and their weapons are less powerful. And by every measure we use to judge civilizations, they are weaker than us. Then why should we fear them? The first speaker asked. Because strength is not the only thing that wins wars, Desha replied. And sometimes the species that survives is not the strongest, but the most stubborn, the most creative, the most unwilling to accept defeat. She looked around the chamber at each council member in turn. Humans have a word for what they are, she said, and that word is tenacious. And it means they will never stop fighting, never stop pushing, never stop finding new ways to survive, no matter what obstacles we put in their path. She paused to let her words sink in. If we attack them, she continued, they will fight back and they will lose at first. But they will learn from every defeat and they will adapt to every weapon we use. And eventually they will find a way to hurt us worse than we hurt them. You are afraid, one of the council members accused. Yes, Desha admitted. I am afraid, because I have seen what a single human with 2 swords can do. And I do not want to see what a billion humans with starships and nuclear weapons can do when they are fighting for their survival. The council debated for 3 hours. And Desha waited outside the chamber while they argued and shouted and threatened finally. The doors opened, and the first speaker emerged. The council has made its decision, he said. And the Terran will be released and returned to human space with full diplomatic honors. Desha felt relief wash through her like warm water. "Thank you." "First speaker," she said. "Do not thank me," he replied, his voice cold but thoughtful, "because I am not doing this out of kindness. And I am doing it because your report has convinced me that we cannot afford to make an enemy of humanity." He turned to walk away, then stopped and looked back at her. "Your report will be classified at the highest level," he said, "and its contents will never be shared with the public, because the Valkyrie people cannot know that we chose peace out of fear." Desha nodded, understanding. 2 days later, she stood in the hangar bay as Lyra prepared to board the small ship that would take her home. "I have something for you," Desha said. Holding out a small box, Lyra opened it and found the 2 swords she had used in the arena, polished and sharpened and mounted on a display stand. "I thought you might want to keep them," Desha said, "as a reminder of what you accomplished." Lyra smiled and took the box carefully. "Thank you," she said, "for everything. I added a note to my report," Desha said quietly. "Something that I wanted you to know. Even though you will never see the official document." "What did you write?" Desha's wings spread slightly, catching the hangar lights. "I wrote that when the alien said no species could dual-wield." She picked up 2 swords and said "Defend," Desha said. "And I wrote that she was not asking for mercy when she said that word." "What was she asking for?" Lyra asked, though she already knew the answer. "She was offering it," Desha said. "And we were fortunate enough to recognize the difference." Lyra reached out and touched Desha's arm, a gesture of friendship that crossed the gap between their species. "Maybe someday our people will meet again," Lyra said. "And maybe next time it will be as friends instead of captor and prisoner." "I would like that," Desha said. And she found that she meant it. Lyra boarded the ship, and Desha watched as it lifted off and flew through the hangar doors into the endless night of space. She stood there for a long time, watching the stars, thinking about everything that had happened and everything that might happen in the future. And somewhere in the back of her mind, a voice whispered that humanity was just getting started, and that the galaxy would never be the same now that the Valkyrie knew what humans could really do. She smiled, her wings catching the light one last time, and turned to walk back into the ship. There would be more reports to write, more species to study, more assumptions to be challenged, but she would never forget the human woman who had changed everything with 2 swords and a single word. Defend. It was not a plea, it was a promise, and Desha knew that humanity always kept its promises.